Particles as small as 1/30th the width of human hair are a major public health threat in Korea. I'm talking about fine dust, which in 2013 the WHO classified as a Group 1 carcinogen. Looking up fine dust levels in the morning and wearing masks have become a daily routine for many Koreans. Instead of going out, people choose to stay indoors. This has put a dent in the sales of department stores and shopping malls. In other words, fine dust particles are not only affecting people's daily lives, but also the national economy. On this week's Upfront, we discuss the main causes of fine dust and efforts to reduce it.
Classified as a Group 1 carcinogen by the World Health Organization, fine dust is known as a silent killer. This year alone, about 260 fine dust warnings have been issued here in Korea. With a clear blue sky becoming a rarity, there are growing concerns over the country's deteriorating air quality.
집에서도 창문에 필터도 달고 공기청정기도 계속 쓰고 있는데도 목이 따끔따끔거리거나 아니면 이제 기관지 계통으로 고통을 느낄 때가 있어서 어서 빨리 해결됐으면 하고 바라고 있습니다.
주위 환경을 보면은 날씨도 그렇고 뿌여진 게 먼저 느껴지고요. 날씨가 좋아서 외출하고 싶은데 미세먼지 때문에 외출하는 게 꺼려지고 있어요. 그리고 앱을 통해서 많이 자주 확인하고 있습니다.
네, 미세먼지 때문에 외출할 때마다 맨날 마스크 끼는데 근데도 걱정되는 건 마찬가지인 것 같아요.
Recently, President Moon Jae-in has revealed his plan to shut down coal-fired power plants that are over 30 years old and replace them with environmentally friendly power plants.
노후 석탄 화력 발전소는 제1기 중에 전부 앞당겨서 폐쇄하고 친환경 발전소로 전환하려고 합니다.
There are varied opinions on the causes of fine dust. But in March, when the nation's fine dust levels were at an all-time high, the Ministry of Environment released a report that found up to 86% of the ultra-fine dust particles originated from overseas, especially China. Calls are growing to take action to counter fine dust blowing in from China. What can be done to tackle the fine dust blanketing the country? On this week's Upfront, we explore the main culprits behind the fine dust emissions and discuss effective measures to improve the air quality.
For today's discussion, we are joined by two experts. Let's welcome Sunwoo Young, professor in the Department of Environmental Engineering at Konkuk University, and Kim Ji-seok, Energy Innovation Manager at the British Embassy in Seoul. Welcome.
Hi.
Now, a recent survey found that more than half of the people living in the Seoul metropolitan area have suffered from respiratory diseases, eye irritation, or skin trouble due to fine dust. This sounds like a serious health threat. What exactly is fine dust and just how harmful is it to the human body?
Well, it's tiny, tiny particles. So we call it dust, but scientifically it's a little bit different. So it's so small that it can stick to your lung cells, irritate your the breathing system. So it's well known that, and also it can lead to mortality and morbidity. Mortality is someone with a serious health problem. I mean, can die a bit early, and morbidity you suffer from coughing and respiratory disease. So it's well known that those material pollutants can bother you, make your children cough, and which can be also psychologically painful. So, yeah.
And the biggest problem is that fine dust carries a lot of toxic substances.
When the media gets a hold of a topic like this and the general public is really aware and everybody's an expert, sometimes there's a tendency to simplify things a little more. So let me just up front, really in the beginning, I like to lay out some difficulties regarding this problem without trying to be too boring or anything. First, there's four aspects that I would really like the general public to understand. The complexity of the problem is very severe. The first problem I'd like to focus on is that there's a local aspect and a transboundary aspect. So we know that Korea can, we have our own problems. We have our own issues. We emit our own pollutants. But there's also a part that's coming over from China. Then there's a little more complicated aspect where we say in in expert terms, is primary and secondary, meaning that there's material that is actually emitted, but we also make it in the atmosphere. You know, we make the particles in the atmosphere from gases that are emitted. So when we say dust, we always get the image that it's just, you know, dust, wind-blown dust, but there's actually a significant portion that is made in the atmosphere. And then there's a problem of natural versus the man-made. So like we know very well that yellow sand is natural blowing over here. Man-made, you know, are emissions. Then there's a final aspect where there's, and this has to do with the health impacts, like Mr. Kim said, the size of the particle. The smaller they are, the more they're going to be harmful and more penetrating. But it's also important, like you said, about what the composition of the particle. Diesel particles are obviously much more dangerous than the sand particles. So all these different aspects makes the problem really complicated, and how we attack the problem depends on how we look at the problem.
And people usually check fine dust concentration or alert levels in the morning to get an idea of the day's air quality. But apparently, Korea applies weaker standards on fine dust than the WHO does. Is that true? Why is there a difference between from one country to another?
Yeah, like I said, everybody's an expert these days about fine dust. I'd like to read you something from the WHO guidelines for PM. And these are the guidelines. WHO is the World Health Organization. The WHO air quality guidelines for PM or particulate matter. It says here, these guidelines are intended to inform policymakers to provide appropriate targets for a broad range of policy options for air quality management in different parts of the world. So the two key words here are guidelines. Okay, that's one word. It's not a standard, actually. It's a guideline, so something we can strive forward. And then the second word is target. And they also have a comment regarding interim targets. So most of the countries in the world do not have standards that are in tune with the WHO standards. It's much more loose, if you will. And in a country like ours with international influences and local problems and still high pollution levels, we can strive toward that, but that's something we target, we strive for, and we have to work toward it. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done.
Wouldn't it be better if there was just an international standard? I mean, humans are humans wherever they are.
Sure, and the health standard is the same, but you don't want to scare people by saying that, okay, every single time you're not going to be healthy enough for something. Every country has a different amount of technology or aptitude to treat the problem. So I think the WHO has those kind of interim targets to account for that fact.
So obviously it's important to identify the cause, the exact cause, in order to find a solution. What are the main causes of fine dust? A lot of Koreans believe it has largely to do with pollutants blowing in from China.
It's not just China as a country emitting. It's the say coal combustion for electricity generation, and car emissions, and industrial pollutants. Same in Korea. So whenever you burn something, burn fuel, with the exception of like natural gas is much less polluting. But when you burn coal, when you run diesel cars, you get these particulate matters, with what we call dust. At the same, or the materials that actually can be ingredient to form small particulate matters in the air with mixing with other things. So yes, it's China, yes, some, South Korea, some, but coal burning in China, coal burning in South Korea, diesel cars in China, diesel cars in Korea, and there are other sources, of course. And so
Professor Soni, you mentioned the two different sources, domestic source and transboundary source. What's the proportion?
On an yearly average, it's there are all sorts of different kinds of statistics. On an yearly average, they say about 40 to 60%. But when we have very high ranges or high
40 to
concentrations
60% from China?
From China,
oh,
yeah.
okay.
So somewhat about half. But when we have those episodes of really high concentrations, it goes from about 60 to 80%. Okay. So I know I sound like a very boring professor when I talk about 3 factors, 4 aspects, and stuff like that. But there are 3 factors that decide concentrations of the PM pollution. And like I said, the first one was domestic. Second one was cross-boundary or international. There's a third factor that's very important, that's more difficult for the public to understand, and that's the meteorological factor. And that's weather, basically. And we had some terrible pollution problems from the beginning part of this year, from January to March. If you look at the weather statistics for that part of this year, there are three factors that influence that, and one is the wind direction. Okay, obviously, all the general public now knows we're living in an area in Korea where it's westerlies. The wind flow is mainly westerly. That means coming from China to Korea and going through Japan. But there's also a significant portion of the wind direction that's northwesterly. Okay, and if you look at Seoul, exact northwest is north of Beijing. So that's relatively cleaner air than Beijing and the south part, where on the eastern coast of China, where you have a lot of industry. So, and these 3 months in the beginning of the year had a very high frequency of wind direction that was more westerly than northwesterly. So that was a bad aspect. And then the stability factor. In economics or politics, stability is good. In air pollution, stability is bad. It basically means it's too stagnant, accumulating the pollutants. You don't clean it out enough. So basically, that was also very prevalent for the first 3 months. The final factor is rain. We didn't have enough rain. Obviously, you know that when the rain comes, it cleans everything out. It's really clear skies and everything. So the weather factor might be called a little bad luck. You have to be careful when you say that, because everybody says, it's luck. You have to prepare for these kind of situations. But the fact remains that in the first 3 months of the year, those three meteorological factors, or the weather factors, sort of combined to be a bad situation for the Korean air pollution problem.
Well, with those weather factors still considered, China is a major culprit here then.
Oh, certainly. There is the international factor, the cross-boundary factor we call coming from the outside is significant. Yes.
Now, President Moon Jae-in has acknowledged the severity of Korea's fine dust problem and pledged to reduce fine dust by 30% during his term. Since taking office, he has ordered a temporary shutdown of aging coal-fired power plants and promised to curb the number of diesel cars on Korea's roads as well. Now, the big question is, how effective will these initiatives be in reducing fine dust?
I like the direction we're going in. I just don't think a couple of those things are going to solve the entire problem. So I think we need to have a more comprehensive attitude and comprehensive approach to the entire problem. Like I said in the beginning, it's a very complex problem, and we don't want to simplify it too much so that we have an approach that is very less cost efficient.
In Europe, though, isn't there a widespread movement to curb the number of diesel cars?
Yes, because diesel has been found to emit not particulate matters, but NOx, which actually can turn into particulate matters. And at the same time, to make it a little bit more complicated, so it's not about, the dust problem is the big issue in Korea, but in Europe, the reducing CO2 emission to make the limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And that's seen as a very, very serious target that not many people tend to pay attention to. And so in order to tackle CO2 emission, UK, for example, has decided to go all electric cars by 2050. And that means you got to start now. And the UK has deployed about 98,000 plug-in cars, so which some of them have some engine, some of them has no engine. And next year, the iconic black cab in UK are going electric or plug-in hybrid. And so they are investing in rapid chargers so they can serve public without polluting the air. So in Europe, it's more driven by CO2 emission plus other pollutant.
Climate change pledges.
Climate change, yeah. So coal is regarded as something that you should not just expand, but really try to reduce as quickly as possible. So that's another factor that I would like to add. So it's not just about like having cheap to operate like diesel cars and tackling pollution and striking balance between economy and health. but it's actually CO2 is also there. And
yes, Mr. Kim brings up a good point about the interchange and interaction with climate change. Similar with climate change, there's also another aspect that we have to consider is that I think we need a control tower for the management from government. And we talk about that a lot with climate change, but I think it also works for the particulate air pollution problem. The Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy is doing their job. I mean, their job is to provide energy at a very cheap cost to the general public. The Ministry of Environment has their own job to try to clean up the air and environment. There's nothing wrong with what they're doing for themselves, but they need, the government needs some kind of a control tower above them, so to speak, to be able to address these issues and try to do what is most efficient for the country as a whole.
These domestic efforts alone will not be enough, though. We are going to have to tackle the China problem as well. What can be done about the windblown dust originating from China, where we know that industrialization is in full swing?
Windblown dust, if we talk about natural dust like yellow sand, for example, that's there's a method to tackle that, maybe planting trees and other things. When we talk about industrial emissions, that's a different thing.
Right.
So people tend to confuse that, so that's the first point I wanted to make. As far as China goes, I think it's important to understand that China needs to correct their air pollution problem just as much for themselves as for us.
Right.
So, and they are making a lot of efforts. It's not like they're the big bad wolf or something that is not doing anything, but obviously it's not enough from our standpoint. So I think, and there's some reports that now they're moving things downwind of Beijing, which was good for Beijing, but which will be bad for us. So those kind of things we need to deal with on a diplomatic level. And we need to keep talking. There is a meeting of the 3 environmental ministers between Korea, China, and Japan. It hasn't really done that much, I think, right now for the particulate problem. But again, those kind of efforts needs to continue. The second thing I think we need to do is there are some collaborative research projects that are going on between China and Korea, and China, Japan, and Korea. I think those needs to be continued and encouraged more. To try to solve it as a regional problem rather than just a Korea problem. Then thirdly, I think, speaking from professor researcher standpoint, is that we need to have a more international global consensus on the problem, that China is a major factor in Korea's air pollution particulate problem. And how we do that is by presenting in a lot of international conferences, publishing in a lot of peer-reviewed papers where the international research community is acknowledging the fact that this is a problem that is partly responsible for China, and having China acknowledge that through the recognition of those kind of peer-reviewed papers.
Because China so far is refusing to acknowledge that Korea's fine dust problem is partly due to them.
Yeah, they've come a long way in opening up their situation and their emissions, but there's a way to go.
Yeah, so we need more objective and scientific evidence to show China.
Right, and there are programs going on, like there's a program between Korea and the United States called CHORUS program that is using satellites and actually using airplane measurements and local measurements to tackle that problem and some other problems. So we're working toward that, but there's a long way to go.
Yeah. I understand that European countries went through a similar experience with Germany during its industrialization. How did Europe respond to this problem of transboundary pollution?
Right, so it's quite an interesting story. So Norway relies only on hydropower, so they don't burn any coal much at all. However, they found their lakes are getting acidified from SOx-induced acid rain. So they were wondering why it's happening, and they learned that they launched a study to find out where this is coming from. They set up many monitoring stations and learned that it's actually emission from Germany, which is getting all the way to Norway. And so they signed some kind of treaty, international treaty, to acknowledge the problem and continue monitoring and tackle the problem together. So, but they didn't tackle it by like suing each other or anything or asking for compensation. They developed something like sulfur desulfurization technology, which reduce sulfur content in fuel, so when you burn it, you don't get the sulfur emission. And so when you don't generate it, it doesn't fly to other countries, and so that's problems reduced. So, but it was not just on the sulfur, but it was on the all other kind of sort of pollutants, because they don't care where the borderline is. They will just happily cross over. So, but monitoring, treaty, and they work together to get it under control.
So I guess in that case, Germany admitted it was partly to blame for what was happening in Norway.
Yes, I think the scientific study is done, evidence is there, and it's pretty simple. I mean, when you burn coal, you get this sulfur emission, and if it's small enough and the wind is in the right direction, it will get there. So,
Because fine dust affects people's daily lives, many wonder if there's any immediate solution to the problem. There's been talk of cloud seeding to produce artificial rain so that we can wash it all away, or flying drones that are equipped with dust-removing filters. How plausible are these ideas?
Yeah, a personal opinion, I don't feel that these kind of measures will do a sufficient job in solving the problem. That doesn't mean that somebody can't come up with a solution that is technically very advanced in the near future. But I think a major problem when people try to deal with this kind of problem is that they don't realize the scale or the scope of the problem. I mean, the atmosphere is almost unlimited. The space, it's very difficult to grasp that kind of spatial factor, and a few drones in the atmosphere gobbling up particles is just not going to be enough. So, like I said before, it's just not one or two things that will solve this problem. It's going to be have to be a very comprehensive effort on both the government side, from the diplomatic and the technical side.
By the way, from the point of technology, is it evolving fast enough to address some of the concerns that we're discussing today?
Well, you know, the Korean people are very much in a hurry, and nothing is ever fast enough, I don't think. But there is a lot of advances that are going on. And again, from a personal standpoint, I don't think there has been enough investment in this area to merit such a advancement or talk about advancement. But again, there is some work being done, a lot of work being done, try to technically solve the problem. But again, we have a long way to go.
So
another thing I would like to add is the dust problem. Say, for example, for coal, you can do you can apply some technologies to reduce it. However, it doesn't reduce CO2 emission. So, as Professor said, in terms of air quality management, the air seems to be unlimited. But when it comes to planetary CO2 emission, global warming problem, the problem is the atmosphere is actually limited in how much CO2 it can take and keep the planet relatively cool, so we can continue living in a pleasant manner. So, then again, so it comes down to changing fuel, changing energy source. So, for example, in the UK, not just because to tackle dust emission, the fine particulate matters, coal burning for power generation has gone down by 80% over last 10 years. And the renewable energy, wind and solar, has increased by 1,000% from 1% to about 1.4% to 14% over 10 years. And the pace is accelerating. And however, unfortunately, that's not actually fast enough. So when tackling the dust emission, the problem we have, it's always important to factor in the CO2 emission, and then, but usually the solution is quite similar. And at the moment, solar and wind and offshore wind are regarded as the kind of the key technologies. It has its own problems. It goes on and off, so that's need to be managed. But that's a solution that's UK government think is good for climate change and good for air quality.
I think that is very, very important. We have a tendency to concentrate on a problem that is immediate, and then we don't look past that very much. And then after this problem dies down, then we sort of leave it for a while and then come to another problem. There are other pollutants that are still a major problem for the general public. For example, ozone or hazardous air pollutants. We have to tackle that before it becomes a problem, like the particulate matter problem. Now, it's very nice that we're tackling, everybody's really into this problem and everybody's, acting on this problem with the particulate matter. But again, there are other problems that we need to look at. And like I said in the beginning, the meteorological, the weather conditions Mr. Kim talked a lot about climate change. We're living in a westerly zone now. We don't know how that's going to change. Climate change can change weather patterns or climate patterns that might be beneficial or detrimental to us. So these kind of things we need to prepare in advance. And we need to have that long-term view. And the things we know we should act upon right now, and things that we need to research more, we need to look at deeper.
What frustrates the Korean public more than the cloud of dust or hazy skies is the absence of clearly identified causes and solutions. Perhaps the success of the Moon Jae-in administration's attempts to battle fine dust will depend on whether we can achieve a scientific identification of the sources of fine dust. Well, thank you very much, Professor Sunwoo and Mr. Kim, for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you.
That's all for this week. Upfront will be back next week. Thanks for watching.